So, our topic today is unearthing the Bible, doing that through archaeology. And I'd like to look at four different words and two subtopics under this. So, we have myth, legend, and history. And those three we'll talk about together. And then we have interpretation, which of course connects to these other words, but we're going to look at some separate categories that have some intertwining. Well, first of all, let's define a few things. Myth, a basic definition, would be a traditional ancient story dealing with supernatural beings, ancestors, or heroes. And this serves as a fundamental type in the worldview of a people or a culture. So we might sum that up as a fictional story. Now, this is often how people think of the Bible or different sections of narrative in the Bible. They often think of it as myth. Next, we have legend. We might put this one a little bit closer to physical reality, historical reality, but we could define legend as an unverified story handed down from earlier times. And it's especially one that is popularly believed to be historical, but it's not verifiable. So you probably heard many legends throughout your life. Sometimes people talk about urban legends, but a legend is something that is usually thought of by people as this happened, or a lot of people think it happened, but they don't have a way of verifying it. So that's another way that people often think about different sections of the Bible, different narratives of the Bible. They might push it beyond myth, but say it's legend. We think it happened, but there's no way that we can verify that. And then finally, we get to history, which is simply a record of past events. This is usually in chronological order, so we would call it a true account, nonfiction. And it's typically in narrative style. Of course, history doesn't always have to be written in narrative style, but usually is. So we're going to look at how archaeology can help us to distinguish between myth, legend, and history in terms of specific narratives in the Bible. And then secondarily, we'll look at how archaeology can be useful in our interpretation of the Bible. The illumination of the historical context, help in translation, help in interpretation. Well, let's begin with an example of archaeology and interpretation. And in this case, it's specifically archaeology and translation. So if you read 1 Samuel 13:21 and you have a newer translation of the Bible, there is no problem there. There's no confusion there. But if you went to before 1917 and looked in translations of the Bible, you would not have a completely correctly translated verse. The reason being is that there is a Hebrew word used in this passage that was completely unknown. It's the Hebrew word pim. So there were different ways of translating it, or it was left out entirely. Just guesses were made. But archaeological excavations in the early 20th century at the site of Gezer, well-known biblical site, eventually uncovered this small rounded stone weight, and it was inscribed with three Hebrew letters reading Pim. And when it was weighed, they found that the weight was 2/3 of a shekel. So the shekel was a standard weight used in the system of ancient Israel. This 2/3 of a shekel would be equivalent to about 7.6 grams. And since then, many more of these Pim weights have been discovered. So they're well known now, but again, until archaeological excavations in the early 20th century, we had no idea what Pim was referring to. So 1917, that started to be changed in translation. So what are two things this tells us? Well, first of all, as we stated, archaeology can help us with translation of the Bible in certain instances. It may be unknown words that we later discover the meaning of through archaeological excavation and research. Secondly, this discovery, I think, also tells us something else, think it tells us that the writer of Samuel was either contemporary or used ancient source material that was later lost. Why would I say this? Because the use of this pim weight stopped during the monarchy period. So you go into the Babylonian exile and then the Persian period and so on. And this weight was not being used anymore. That's why we didn't know how to translate it. That's why it hadn't been discovered earlier. And so this tells us that Samuel was written down prior to the Babylonian exile. Of course, that is in contrast with the general view of the documentary hypothesis that most of the Old Testament was written during the Babylonian period and Persian period. Well, the next example we have of archaeology and interpretation comes from a slightly different angle, and this is chronology. So it's not strictly translation, but it is understanding of numbers, chronological numbers in the Bible. And the example that I'm going to use connects to 1 Kings 6:1. This is quite a famous passage because it's connected to Solomon, the temple that he built, and the Exodus. Well, it reads, in the 480th year after the Israelites came up out of Egypt, in the fourth year of King Solomon's reign over Israel, that's when he began to build the temple in Jerusalem. So, a straightforward reading of that, knowing Solomon's fourth year was about 967 BC, and that is almost universally acknowledged because of synchronization with king lists in the ancient Near East. But straightforward reading, we would simply add 479 full years. Okay, it's in the 480th year, so 480 lapsed yet. And that would put the Exodus from Egypt around 1446 BC. All right, now, if we're just looking at biblical passages here, we might also try to untangle some of the interpretive issues by looking at other sections of Scripture. Numbers 33, for example, verses 3 through 38 in particular, I think, shows us that an Exodus era numbering system was used by the ancient Israelites. Now, era system counting was quite common in the ancient world, so this shouldn't come as a surprise, but we often see things in reference to in this month after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in this year after the Israelites came out of Egypt. So they're counting from this extremely important historical event. Well, we also have a couple other passages that overlap with this chronological idea. One is in Judges 11:26, and it notes that while Israel had lived in all the cities that are on the banks of the Arnon 300 years. So this is Jephthah, and the time of Jephthah was roughly 1100 BC. So he's just a bit before Saul and Samuel. And 300 years before this, of course, would be 1400 BC. So that would be the time when the conquest begins. But we need to add about 40 years of the wandering period. So we're getting to approximately 1440 BC for the exit from Egypt, the Exodus. So that overlaps. The third passage would be in 1 Chronicles 6:33 through 37. And this is part of a long genealogical list. Well, the section that we're particularly interested in for this purpose is from Heman the singer in the time of David to Korah, who lived in the time of Moses and the wandering. And here we have essentially 18 full generations and 2 half generations listed. So we'll just say 19 generations inclusive. Now, why is this important? Well, first note, this is not 12 generations. It's not an idealized number. There's 19 generations of actual named people. Various studies that have been done on generations from antiquity put them usually at around 22 to 28 years. Now, 25 years is in the middle of that. We can just use that for convenience. And we see that 25 years times 19 generations equals 475 years. Well, that's almost exactly the same as the number that 1 Kings 6:1 gives us. It's also about the same elapsed time that we would derive from looking at Judges 11. I think it's also important to note that the Septuagint variant of 1 Kings 6:1 has the 440th year there. And so that indicates that when the Septuagint was translated in the 3rd century BC, there was no ancient idea being projected on there of a symbolic 12 times 40 type of interpretation. Now, why do I bring up that 12 times 40 symbolic? Well, that brings us to the more archaeological part of this issue, and that is temple dedication texts, or so-called temple dedication genre. These can be dedication, commemoration, rededication. But there is a second school of thought on the understanding of the chronology of the Exodus as recorded in the Bible. And so we have proponents who suggest instead that it happened significantly later in the 13th century BC or the 12th century BC. And they do that because of a difference in interpretation of 1 Kings 6:1 and other passages, of course, where they say that 1 Kings 6:1 is a temple dedication genre text, also found in other cultures of the ancient Near East. So therefore, the 480th year cannot be a real number, is not a real number. So they would say that it is the number 40 symbolic times 12 symbolic. Okay, we see 40 used in the Bible a lot. We see 12 used in the Bible a lot, of course, also. For example, the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, the claim is that these other ancient Near Eastern texts or inscriptions about temple dedications are actually using symbolic numbers as well. But when we do an archaeological analysis of this, we find that is not the case at all. They're actually using real numbers that we're supposed to pay attention to get a defined chronology. The two examples that are cited the most, let's look at those. The first is from Tukulti-Ninurta I. So he's an Assyrian king. He reigned around 1230 to 1200 BC approximately. He had a temple repair or rededication text, and he records that he rebuilt the Ishtar temple at Assur after 720 years had passed from when his ancestor, King Elushuma, had constructed it. Now, if you look at the reign dates for Elushuma and for Tukulti-Ninurta I, you see that they are indeed separated by 720 years. So he's giving us a real number there that it should be understood as an attempt to give us an actual reliable chronology. The second comes from Egypt, and this is the year 400 stela of Ramses II. It's often associated with Seti the First as well, because it actually refers to Seti the First, but Ramses II was the one who seems to have actually had this inscribed. Now, what this does is it commemorates the initial dedication of a temple to Seth at Avaris by, and then this is a commemoration by Seti the First, 400 years later. So it mentions year 400, fourth month of the third season, day 4. So it gives some very specific numbers, a very specific date. But let's just look at the 400 years. Now, according to archaeological excavations at Avaris, specifically the site called Tel El Daba, the temple of Seth there was initially constructed somewhere around 1700 to 1680 BC. So this stele then was inscribed by the son of Seti I, Ramses II, for his father, Seti I, about 400 years later in 1280 BC. So this is very near the beginning of the reign of Ramses II. Seti I had been the previous king. So while this one, we can't look at it with as much precision as the previous Assyrian example, because we just don't know the exact date of dedication of the temple, we do see that it is in the area of about 400 years. So they do appear to be giving us a reliable chronological number that's meant to be understood as a real number. It's certainly not something like 200 or 250 years. It is not rough, symbolic, half of it, anything like that. We have other parallels that we could look at, but what these two major ones demonstrate is that the number of years mentioned in temple dedication texts, including the Temple of Solomon dedication text in 1 Kings 6:1, gives an accurate recounting of real years, or we could say they at least attempt to give us an accurate counting of real years. And that's why we should then read 1 Kings 6:1 and Judges 11:26 and 1 Chronicles 6 as giving us real, reliable historical information, chronological information. And so from that, we can get to the date of the Exodus, and then we can investigate archaeologically from there. Now, about number 40, the number 40, because I brought that up earlier, that was supposedly part of the symbolic formulation used in 1 Kings 6:1. Allegedly, 40, a symbolic number, times 12, a symbolic number. Now, of course, 1 Kings 6:1 doesn't actually have 40 or 12 in there. They have broken a real number apart and then used two that they selected to get to 480, or the 480th year. But it's also not true to state that the number 40 in the Bible or in the ancient Near East is always some symbolic number, just denoting a long period of time. 40 is often used in the Bible, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. It does have theological significance, but that doesn't mean that it can't also have historical truth embedded in it. Well, one of the examples that's used is the Mesha stele, or the Moabite stone. Well, this, of course, is important for many different reasons. If you've ever studied the Mesha stele, it essentially has the Moabite version of what's recorded in 2 Kings chapter 3, verses 4 through 27. But it also mentions the house of David. So it's a 9th century BC Moabite stele that mentions the house of David. That is very important. It also associates Yahweh with Israel. In fact, it's the earliest Semitic inscription that's been discovered that has the name Yahweh on it. So those are three important things: a historical narrative, mention of the house of David early on, and associating Yahweh with Israel. But for our interpretation aspect, we have a couple of lines that we should look at. So the king of Moab is saying, Omri, that is the Israelite king Omri, took the land of Madaba and occupied it in his day, and in the days of his son 40 years. All right, so there's the 40 years that comes out. And the claim is that in the Mesha stele, 40 years is used. It's not 40 years, it's symbolic, and therefore in the Bible we also can't look at 40 years as actually 40 years. It should be symbolic. Well, let's look at another line in the Mesha stele. It says, I am Mesha, son of Chemosh Yat, king of Moab, the Dibonite. My father ruled over Moab for 30 years. So he's giving us a different number. I think that Mesha knew how to count, so he can tell us if something's 30 years or 40 years. Now, when we go to the reign lengths of the Israelite kings that are in this time period, in this 40 years that Mesha claims that the Israelites were dominating him, we see that there is indeed 40 years. So if we just look at Omri, Ahab, and Ahaziah, that is 36 years of reign length. Now, Jehoram is the king who was defeated by Mesha after, according to Mesha, 40 years of oppression. So what does that tell us? That it could have been about 4 years or so into the reign of Jehoram, that it was at least approximately 40 years. Maybe Mesha's off by 3 or 4 years. I'm not sure exactly. We can't say that for certainty right now. But he does seem to be trying to give us 40 years as a real period of time. And we see that confirmed by the reign lengths of these Israelite kings. So 40 also is a real number when used in a chronological sense, as we see many passages in the Old Testament. Well, let's move on past the interpretational aspect, and let's look at some other archaeological connections. We're going to slide back into that Exodus wandering period a bit here that we've been talking about. This also connects to the chronological interpretation that we were seeing, but what about the first or the earliest Yahweh inscriptions that have ever been discovered? Well, these were found at a temple in Soleb, Sudan. This is an Egyptian temple. It was built for the god Amun-Ra by order of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, somewhere around 1400 BC. And it was then decorated for what's called the Hebsed festival of Amenhotep III. Now we have some chronological markers on this temple in addition to the reign of Amenhotep III. First, we have mention of the Cush Rebellion campaign of year 5, which we put that in about 1409 BC. By the way, I'm using the high chronology, not the low chronology, or something similar to that. And then we have Amenhotep III's Hebsed festival. So, what though is on here in relation to Yahweh? Well, we have lists of people and places that were allegedly subjugated or conquered by the Pharaoh. And among these lists of people, there's a name there that includes Yahweh. Let's look at that in more detail. So there are 2 inscriptions at the Soleb temple that have this Yahweh name there. And specifically, this inscription line says, the land of the nomads of Yahweh. So it's talking about a people who are associated with Yahweh, and these people are nomads. So we have one on a column from this Soleb temple. We have one on a wall block from this temple. And then we also have one that's from slightly later at the nearby Amarna West temple on a list. And all of these have the land of the nomads of Yahweh, and they spell Yahweh the same way, which is an appropriate way for spelling Yahweh in Egyptian hieroglyphs. And we see we can divide it into this 4-letter name, the tetragrammaton, just like we have in Hebrew, rendered in Hebrew in the Old Testament. Now, the context of where these people are living, wandering, based on the other place names and people names around them, puts them east of Egypt, somewhere around the Edom, Moab, or Canaan area. And this, of course, is just where the Israelites were during the wandering period, right before they go into Canaan. Or if we put it in Canaan, it's at the beginning of the time when they've just entered the land and they are still nomads. So this appears to be mentioning the Israelites at the end of the wandering period. Why would we associate this with the Israelites? Well, of course, it mentions that they're the people of Yahweh, and we have some interesting passages in the book of Numbers that give similar languages. So Numbers 16:41 calls the sons of Israel the people of Yahweh. Numbers 32:13 also tells us Yahweh made Israel wander in the wilderness. So we see they're wandering, they're nomads, they're the people of Yahweh. We also see back in Exodus 7:5, for example, that one of the points of the plague was that the Egyptians would know, God says, will know that I am Yahweh. So he wanted them to know who he was. We even see the Pharaoh familiar with that name in the Exodus narrative. And of course, here, this is a Pharaoh, this is an Egyptian temple for a Pharaoh, and he knows the name Yahweh. So how did they get that? They must have had some familiarity with the Israelites, because the Israelites were the only people in ancient times who ever worshipped or were associated with Yahweh. You can look at any inscription, any ancient inscription that mentions Yahweh, all of them are connected to the Israelites. There's no other culture. There are no Edomite inscriptions about Yahweh. There are no Canaanite inscriptions about Yahweh, etc. So that's why we can restrict this to the Israelites. It's talking about the Israelites in the wandering period. The Egyptians themselves are familiar. All of this connects very well with the Exodus narrative. And by the way, this also supports our chronological interpretation that we were looking at earlier, because this necessitates an exodus in the 15th century BC, around 1446. Otherwise, they would not have known about Yahweh this early, and you wouldn't have these Yahweh worshiping nomads wandering in the desert or the wilderness to the east of Egypt. Well, that brings us then to an archaeological excavation. Archaeology and Jericho. So we've looked at some interpretive issues, we've looked at some chronological issues, linguistic issues, and the discovery of this inscription. Now let's look at the excavation of a city, and particularly a city that was destroyed during the conquest of Joshua. Joshua 6 tells us that Jericho was tightly shut because of the sons of Israel. So it's a walled city, and they besieged it. No one went out and no one came in. Yahweh said to Joshua, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand with its king and the valiant warriors." So Jericho is located just west of the Jordan River. And if you look at the map, you will see that there are no other Canaanite cities anywhere close to it. This is actually something that helps us be sure that we've identified the correct site. Tel Es Sultan is the archaeological site. You see Gilgal on that map, which is the closest thing, but what was Gilgal? Gilgal was the headquarters for the Israelite camp. It was not a Canaanite city. So there's no confusion about the location of Jericho at Tel Es Sultan. Well, according to the book of Joshua, the Israelites destroyed this city. Excavations have been done there off and on for more than a century. And the stratigraphic layer that we are particularly interested in for the book of Joshua is called Jericho City 4, in fact, City 4C. This would be dated either to the Middle Bronze Age 3 or the Late Bronze Age 1. This depends on your understanding of some of the evidence, the archaeological material that's found there. But basics, let's just think about the city itself. So it has a massive wall that encircles the city in an oval shape. And it was fortified then with a stone retaining wall. You can actually see a man at the bottom of that stone retaining wall. That stone retaining wall is between 4 and 5 meters high all around the site. But then on top of the retaining wall was a mud brick wall that was usually about 2 meters thick. And we don't know the exact height, but based on what's been excavated, it was probably between 6 and 8 meters high. So a very, very tall and formidable wall. But what happened to Jericho City 4C? The walls toppled, in specific, the mud brick walls, not the stone retaining wall. The mud brick walls toppled, other buildings did as well. And the city was destroyed, it was burned. There's a massive fire destruction layer over the entire site there. The grain that was stored in the city was burned also. It was not looted by the attacking army. And then the site was abandoned for a very long period of time, centuries. Let's look at some more details of this wall and the falling of that wall. So the final Bronze Age city, which we're discussing there, Jericho City 4C, the latest rendition of that wall was built in the Middle Bronze Age 3 period. We can just say approximately 1600 BC, plus or minus some years. I just described the retaining wall to you and the mud brick city wall. But the thing that's very strange or unique about Jericho is that the mud brick wall, the remnants of the mud brick wall, that they toppled and they fell in front of the stone retaining wall. So you can see in the drawing on the left there, this pile of fallen red mud bricks and how it formed a sort of ramp that you could walk up into the city. So the fortifications were rendered useless, and then there's a nice path going up into the city. Well, this didn't happen just at one little point. It wasn't a battering ram or a siege tower that broke down one section of wall. It was around most of the city. If you look at the walls of Jericho and all the places that have been excavated, you can see that on the east, the south, the west, the walls toppled down. Only on the north are there some sections that were still standing. You read Joshua 6 and you see something just like this recorded. It says that when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, or some translated upon itself, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight ahead, and they took the city. They burned the city with fire and all that was in it. So we have correlation here between what's recorded in the text and the archaeological discoveries. In fact, more so with this dedicated to destruction idea that we see in Joshua 6:17 through 19, and the burning of the grain that is discovered at Jericho. So here are some photos of massive storage jars full of grain that were found in that fire destruction at Jericho, the final Bronze Age city. This was not according to typical military practice of the time at all. And it tells us that the city fell soon after spring harvest. Well, we know that that was the timing of the attack under Joshua because it happened after the barley harvest, after Passover. So there's a connection on the timing there too. And the absence of looting this also correlates with what is said in Joshua to put the city under the ban, all that is in it. They were only supposed to take the metals to the treasury of Yahweh. So we have some very, very interesting correlations. Seems to go beyond coincidence there. Well, what's the main issue or problem then with Jericho? Because the manner of destruction and even its abandonment fits very well with the biblical narrative, and the manner of destruction is really not disputed so much. What is discussed and debated is the timing, the chronology of this. So when Garstang excavated in the 30s, he thought that Jericho was destroyed about 1400 BC, and he saw how it connected very well to the book of Joshua, and he thought that it then was a historical event. By the way, Garstang was not a Christian, he was not a Jew, he was an agnostic. But when Kenyon came and excavated in the 50s, she said that no, Jericho was actually destroyed in about 1550 BC, much too early for Joshua. And her date was primarily based on the absence of an exotic type of pottery called Cypriot bichrome ware. Unfortunately, Kenyon did not publish her excavation reports. They didn't come out until after her death, about 30 years later almost. And so people couldn't really check all the data. And by the time they could, no one was interested. They just believed her conclusions. But if you go through and you check all the excavation reports, not just from Kenyon, but others, and you look through the material, what you'll find is there indeed was quite a bit of Cypriot bichrome pottery at Jericho, which indicates a late Bronze Age 1 occupation. There's also much local pottery that dates to the late Bronze Age 1. I would say a very useful and easy to understand example of that is number 9, which is an oil lamp. And then we also have another type of exotic ware called chocolate on whiteware, which is very definitively indicative of the late Bronze Age. So what do we have here? We have pottery that's indicating the city fell sometime between 1500 and 1400. But we can narrow that down even more by some other archaeological materials, and that is Egyptian scarabs, royal scarabs. Now, a few of these are particularly important. There is a nearly continuous sequence of Egyptian scarabs from about the 18th century BC to approximately 1400 BC, but in particular, the ones we're looking at here, they're from the 15th century BC. So again, Jericho seems to be occupied between 1500 and 1400 BC. Some claim that these are commemorative scarabs that were made long after the time that these pharaohs reigned, but there's a major problem with two of the three rulers represented. First is Hatshepsut. So the Egyptians tried to wipe her from history. They scratched out her image and her name all over Egypt. So they would not have been making scarabs for Hatshepsut after the time of her reign. Thutmose III, he was indeed very famous and revered. We might get scarabs from him after his reign. That's fine. There's also a seal of Thutmose III here, though, that probably would not have been produced after his reign. But then the third, final, and probably most important is Amenhotep III. Well, Amenhotep III also was not this big military campaigning pharaoh like Thutmose III. His scarabs were not reproduced after his reign. And in fact, he sent no assistance to Canaan when they asked for it in the Amarna letters. So, what's the deal with Amenhotep III? He reigns on either side of 1400 BC. He's the last pharaoh attested at Jericho, which tells us that should be precisely when the city fell. So we're getting right to about 1400 BC. We even have a tablet that was discovered at Jericho in the excavation of what's called the Middle Building. And this was dated to the 1400s BC, the 15th century, on the basis of epigraphy. And there are many parallels with other tablets from Canaan during this time period, 15th to 14th century BC. Places like Shechem and Tanakh have similar ones. And of course, the Amarna letters, the Amarna correspondence, which brings us to our next item. And that is some of the Amarna letters written to and about Shechem. Well, I think Shechem's a very interesting case in the book of Joshua because in Joshua 8 and chapter 24, the Israelites gather there peacefully. And yet there is no narrative about the conquest or destruction of Shechem anywhere in the book of Joshua. And the city is not in that list of kings and cities that is defeated by the Israelites. So what happened there? We don't know from the book of Joshua or other places in the Bible. But I think the Amarna letters tell us what was going on. So many of the Amarna letters were correspondence between the Pharaoh, in particular Amenhotep III for many of them, and kings of Canaan, or mayors of Canaan, if you want to use that terminology. Well, we have some talking about Shechem. For example, Amarna letter 289, we have this question: are we to act like Labayu when he was giving the land of Shechem to the Habiru? So these are other Canaanite kings accusing Labayu of treason to the Pharaoh. What we find out from that is that the ruler of Shechem gave his land to these people they call the Habiru. And then we have another letter, 287, talks about how the sons of Labayu have given the land of the king to the Habiru. So it seems that the land of the Shechem city-state was given to these Habiru people, who we could identify as the Israelites in this case. Now, Habiru is not exclusively restricted to Hebrews or Israelites, but it would be a fitting description for them during that Joshua conquest period time. So I think there's a case where we have both some corroboration, but further illumination and filling in the blanks of what's in the biblical text by archaeology. And then our final example we'll look at today is the tomb of Jesus. So we're jumping all the way ahead to the New Testament. Look at the archaeology of Golgotha and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the tomb of Jesus. So here you can see a side view drawing of the hill and then the rock where the tomb of Jesus was carved out and what's represented today. So you can see the greater Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You can see what's referred to as the Rock of Golgotha. And then you see the site of the tomb of Jesus surrounded by this building that's called the Edicule. Some basic facts about the crucifixion of Jesus from John, Matthew, Mark, and Hebrews. And we know that it was outside of the city walls, outside of the gate. It was in a garden area. There was a tomb there. It was accessible to people walking by, and it could be seen from far away. We also know that it was shaped like a cranium, the top of a skull, okay, not the face of a skull. So there's some kind of hill, and it should be probably near the tomb. I put a question mark, stone hill, inside the area of the present church because I don't think we can be certain about the location of Golgotha, but it's certainly plausible. Now, the tomb of Jesus, we know more about. The tomb of Jesus is described as a new tomb, so they had just cut it then in the first century, cut it out of the rock. It was single chamber, which is very important. There was a burial bench on which to place the body, and then it was sealed with a large stone. Again, we get this information from the gospel accounts, from eyewitness accounts. Well, what has been there over the centuries? So we have a tomb, we have a temple, and we have a church. Well, the construction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre began about 325 AD during the reign of Constantine I. He sent his mother and his architect over there, and they actually inquired with the Bishop of Jerusalem. All the locals knew where the tomb of Jesus was because there had been a continuous Christian presence in Jerusalem since the time of Jesus, and the resurrection is the most important event in Christianity. So they're going to remember where the tomb is. Now, Eusebius, church historian, recorded that the tomb had been built over by the Roman Emperor Hadrian, who wanted to obscure and eliminate the memory of the resurrection of Jesus. He wanted to suppress or erase Christianity, and he wanted to syncretize it with Roman religion. So he built a double temple to Jupiter and Venus over the tomb, possibly also the crucifixion hill, but this was during his reconstruction of Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina, about 135 AD. And we can see an example of this double temple if you go to Rome, because Hadrian built a double temple to Roma and Venus just next to where the Colosseum is today. So we have precedent of that type of temple. Well, if we go and we look at what archaeological investigations have found regarding this tomb, we see several important points. First of all, the church and the tomb are north of the early first century AD walls of Jerusalem. So they are outside of the walls at the time of Jesus. This is confusing for a lot of people because they look at the old city walls today and may not realize those are the Ottoman walls built in the 16th century AD. Secondly, it's in an area that was formerly a quarry until the first century BC when it was filled and it became a garden. So it's a garden area. There have been other first century tombs discovered within this garden area cemetery. For example, the tomb of Joseph. You can go see that inside the church today still. Fourth, the burial bench from the original stone carved tomb is still in existence. Now it was covered with a marble slab in the 4th century. That's what you're seeing in the bottom photo there. But when National Geo did restoration of the tomb, they removed this, and you could actually see the original carved limestone burial bench from the tomb. It is a single chamber arcosolium type tomb. So this is the type that Jesus was buried in. This is important because there aren't other single chamber tombs of that type in Jerusalem from the Roman period. And then finally, we also know that crucifixion victims in first century Jerusalem were in fact allowed formal burial. They weren't all just tossed into a random pit somewhere. And one of the main pieces of evidence for that is the Yehohanan ossuary, who was a crucifixion victim in first century Jerusalem. So we can sum this up that we have a tomb cut into the limestone in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre there, dated to the first century AD. It comes from before the building of that Roman temple. It's the only single chamber arcosolium type tomb of the Roman period in the entire Jerusalem area. This is very important. Other tombs were used for families, and so they were expanded. No one reused this tomb, though, this tomb of Jesus. It fits all the descriptions that we have in the Gospels. Yes, today it's obscured. Some of it has been cut apart because of the building of the edicule in the church. But some of the characteristics of the original tomb are still present, and we can see that this is not just a good candidate for the tomb of Jesus, but it has continuous Christian reverence and historical memory since the first century, and architecturally and archaeologically, it fits all the requirements. So I think that we can say this was indeed the tomb of Jesus. Now, going back to the beginning, we had myth, legend, and history. And I want to just end with a passage that relates to these words from 2 Peter 1:16. Peter, who of course was a disciple of Jesus and an eyewitness of the events, he says, "For we did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty." So we see Peter telling us specifically these were not myths. And we find out through archaeological investigation that these narratives in the Bible were not myth, they were not legend, but they are history that we have been able to verify through archaeological and historical research. Thank you, and I'll be happy to take any questions now.